Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
What can the history of morality tell us about the nature of morality and about ourselves as human beings? Alistair MacIntyre, the Marxist-turned-Catholic philosopher, he once observed that ethics finds its meaning in the distinction between what he called man as he happens to be and man as he could be. What he means is that morality is a kind of map guiding us from where we are to where we want to be. But the point I would want to make is that it's a very strange kind of map. Morality is a kind of map in which both the starting point and the destination are created on the journey itself. Man as he happens to be is not a given. The understanding of what it is to be human, of human nature, has changed over time. And it has changed as the vision of man as he could be has also transformed. The kind of being we can be depends partly on the kind of being that we are. But the kind of being we imagine that we can be, also paradoxically perhaps, shapes how we think of ourselves as we are today. And you can see that if you look at the way that morality has changed historically. In the pre-modern world, morality grew out of the structure of the community, a structure that was a given. But few people entertained the idea that it was possible to collectively change society by will. In the ancient world, fate was seen as a social reality, and there was no evading it. Human life was defined by the inevitability of death, by the universality of sorrow and of suffering, the tragedy of being answerable to one's actions and yet imprisoned by fate. And morality was about how to define right and wrong within the given structures of a society. Every individual possessed a fixed place in society from which derived his or her duties and rights and obligations. And moral rules both derived from and defined their role within that community, their duties to each other, and the actions that were compatible with those roles and those duties. From about the 6th century BCE, what has come to be called the heroic society, the society of which Homer wrote, for instance, gave way to more settled, productive, innovative societies for Socrates and Buddha, for Confucius and Mo Tzu. The starting point of moral discussion was the idea of humans as, to some extent at least, as rational beings. All, to a greater or lesser degree, looked to reason as a means of finding answers in a world that was constrained by fate, an argument perhaps taken furthest in the ancient world by Aristotle. The gods of the ancients were not wise and judicious like the later gods of Islam or Christianity or Judaism. They were rather capricious, vain, vicious, deceitful, immoral, and they were also immensely powerful. And this was in part the way that the ancients saw the world: messy, chaotic, largely unpredictable, barely controllable, and yet inescapable. And it expressed the tragedy of being human, to desire freedom, to be tortured by a sense of autonomy, and yet be imprisoned by forces beyond our control. With tragedy, however, came dignity. Ancient gods acted by whim. Only humans were truly accountable for their actions. Human life was framed by the gods, and yet humans could not rely upon them in a way that, say, that later, with the monotheistic gods, humans looked to the gods for wisdom and moral truth. Rather, humans had to depend upon their own wit and resources. It was human reason and human morality that imposed order upon an unpredictable world and carved out dignity and honour within it. Striking that ancient Greek culture is, to a modern sensibility, both an alien moral world and one upon which we constantly draw for our moral insights. It's alien because many of the concepts that are at the heart of modern moral thought, the individual, the mind, conscience, choice, barely existed in the ancient world, or it did so in a very different way to the way we think about these issues now. And yet we draw upon the ancient world because the ancients wrestled with many of the fundamental moral conundrums that we still wrestle with today. Fate, free will, human choice, the individual, the community. And they attempted to apply reason to try and resolve them. The coming of monotheism, of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam, transformed the vision of human nature and the character of moral thinking. For the monotheist, there was, of course, but one God, all-powerful and constrained by nothing. And this new vision of God had an immense impact on moral thought and the way we saw the questions of good and bad. Ancient gods were very human, in fact, all too human. The monotheistic God was terrifyingly defined. There's a chasm between the human and the divine world, which comes with monotheism, that simply did not exist in the ancient world. I always think about that passage in the Bible where Moses first meets God and God says, "Draw not near me." And that sense that humans must not approach gods in that way was something entirely new. At the same time, the notion of God creating humans in his own image helped monotheistic thinkers enlarge the meaning of humanity. The dignity of the individual, in principle at least, derived not from his or her participation in a specific community, but through their God-given nature. And yet what God giveth with one hand, he taketh away with the other. Within the monotheistic traditions, the idea of a universal humanity was always constrained by the nature of faith. Equality was equality in the eyes of a Christian or an Islamic or a Jewish God. Hence the long and fractious debates among Christians, among Muslims, well into the early modern period, about whether non-Christians, say, were equal or even possessed souls. Other pre-modern traditions, the Greek Stoics, for instance, or certain strands of Buddhism, or the philosophy of Mo-tzu in China, faced no such constraints. Similarly, the idea of God's will and of a being acting freely and without constraints, which is a revolutionary idea, helped monotheists develop new ways of thinking about human agency. But here too, the concept was constrained by the faith. Will, for instance, in the Christian tradition, could be understood only in the context of belief in the fall and in original sin. It's impossible for humans to do good on their own account in the Christian tradition because the fall has degraded both their moral capacity and their willpower. Only through God's grace can humans achieve salvation. And the doctrine of original sin, it seems to me, is perhaps the most profound contribution of Christianity to the Western tradition. It's also perhaps its most pernicious. The real importance of the emergence of monotheism was not so much in establishing a new kind of moral code, but in establishing a new reason for abiding by that code. God tells you. Why should one do as God tells you? Not simply because God was all-powerful and all-knowing, but also because only through him could humans, who are now fundamentally morally weak, morally frail, be rescued from their own wickedness and weakness. All moral codes possess two elements: a set of values to pursue and a reason for pursuing those values. the importance of monotheism is that they developed a novel way of thinking about the relationship between means and end. God is the end. God is also the means to that end. And the consequence of this new way of thinking about means and ends was that morality became far more rule-bound. Morality emerged less out of wisdom and flourishing and of reason than out of faith, submission, and law. Monotheism made humans both greater and lesser than they had been before. Humans had been created by God in his image, and yet humans were now seen weak and corrupt and flawed and broken. And where the ancient Greeks and the ancient Chinese, where Confucians and Buddhists had seen humans as carving out a space for dignity and honor within an unpredictable universe, and in the face of capricious and often immoral gods, the monotheists insisted that humans could not be good on their own account, but only through God. The emergence of the modern world, from that 16th century onwards, brought with it major changes that transformed the language of morality. First, the idea that morality should be invested in God became far less plausible. Not only did religious belief erode over time, but even those devout thinkers, Immanuel Kant, for instance, were less likely to look to God to set out moral boundaries. Second came the dissolution of traditional communities. Social structures were no longer given, but became contested, both politically and physically. Liberals and socialists, conservatives and communists, monarchists and republicans all contested the idea of what a good society constituted. And third, the concept of individual autonomy became far more important. In the pre-modern world, an individual's identity and interest was bound up almost entirely with the community in which he or she lived. By the 17th century, the individual was emerging as a social actor in his or her own right, and one detached from the specifics of a community. The recognition that society could be transformed and the emergence of social mechanisms for effective such transformation transformed also the language of morality. As people rejected the idea of society, of social structures as a given, so what we ought to do, became a political rather than merely a moral demand. How society ought to be was defined by the political possibilities of social change. A very revolutionary change. The new moral visions of modernity may have been nourished by the crumbling of what you may call the God-ordained order. But they were also, however, rooted in faith, but a different kind of faith. Faith that humans were capable of acting rationally and morally without guidance from beyond. It was that faith that drove the Enlightenment and drove the humanist tendencies and the optimism of the 18th and 19th centuries. By the end of the 19th century, however, that faith too had begun to be eaten away. And they began developing a much darker view of what it meant to be human, as the optimism about human capacities that had originally suffused the humanist impulse began to ebb away. The late 19th century experienced not simply a crisis of faith, what Nietzsche called the death of God, but also what has been called the crisis of reason, the beginnings of a set of trends that were to become highly influential in the 20th century. If Nietzsche was the high priest at God's funeral, he was also the chief celebrant at reason's wake. And the history of the 20th century, 2 world wars of depression, the Holocaust, Auschwitz, the gulags, climate change and ethnic cleansing, helped further shatter that old sense of hope and optimism about human capacities. Looking upon morality historically shows us that ethics does not occupy a sphere of its own, distinct from the rest of life. Our understanding of good and bad, of right and wrong, have transformed over time, shaped by myriad social trends, political desires, material constraints. This, however, leads perhaps to a troubling conclusion. To view morality in this fashion seems to undermine the very idea of morality. He seemed to be destined to view morality in a manner of Thrasymachus, a figure in Plato's The Republic, where Thrasymachus observes that there are many kinds of societies, political systems in Greece. Each had a different conception of justice, but all benefited the ruling class. Democracy, he says, makes democratic laws. Tyranny makes tyrannical laws. And all declare that what they have made, what is to their advantage, to be just for their subjects. And they punish anyone who goes against this as lawless and unjust. Conventional morality for him is a scam, a set of rules invented by the ruling class to promote its own interests and to keep everyone in check. And a modern version of that, I suppose, may be Nietzsche. Philosophy for Nietzsche is not the will to truth, but the will to power. Philosophers, he argues, are cunning pleaders for their prejudices, which they baptize truths. Morality is an expression of power. Power is an assertion of morality. And for many of Nietzsche's critics, the amorality of Nietzsche's ideas are intimately linked to his rejection of God. The death of God for many has also meant the death of morality. And it's become the almost reflexive response of believers when faced with the argument for a godless world. Without religious faith, runs the argument, we cannot anchor our moral truth or truly know right from wrong, but we'll be lost in a miasma of moral nihilism in which everyone picks and chooses whatever values they wish. The trouble with that argument is that even if you believe in God, you still have to pick and choose your values and decide what is right and wrong. Consider the Bible. Leviticus sanctifies slavery. It tells you that if man committed adultery, then both the adulterer and the adulterer shall be put to death. According to Exodus, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and so on. Few modern-day Christians would accept such commands, but other commands they clearly accept. And it's not that God has changed his mind, it's that humans have, societies have. And as societies transform, so do our moral values. Each reads their own holy book in a way that allows them to fit it into their own moral universe. The same is true of Muslims, for instance, jihadi literalists between so-called bridge builders like Tariq Ramadan and Muslim liberals, each of which interpret the Quran in very different ways with very different moral universes. The fundamental problem with the idea that God can tell us what is right and wrong was expressed 2,000 years ago by Plato in the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. In his dialogue, Euthyphro, Plato has Socrates asking a question which has become a key to our world too. Do the gods love the good because it is good? Or is it good because it is loved by the gods? In other words, unless the gods love something for no good reason, then they must love something, declare it to be good, because it inherently possesses value. But if it inherently possesses value, then it does so independently of the gods, and we don't need a god to tell us what is or is not good. Now, one response to this dilemma in recent years has been to suggest that moral codes are revealed not by God, but by science. The American writer Sam Harris, for instance, argues that values are, in essence, facts about the world, and so can be studied by science. Good values are those that promote well-being, and well-being can be objectively defined. And so moral values can be scientifically understood by studying brain and behavior. But the Euthyphro dilemma applies here too. Scientific studies may be able to tell us which brain states correlate with which particular real-world conditions. But whether those brain states are seen as indicators of well-being depends on whether we consider those real-life conditions as expressing well-being. If well-being is simply defined by the existence of certain brain states or hormonal measures, then the notion of well-being is arbitrary. If such a definition is not to be arbitrary, then it can only be because such a neurotransmitter level or whatever correlates with a notion of well-being, of the good, which has been arrived at independently of the science. Are moral answers merely subjective, a matter of taste? Or were Thrasymachus and Nietzsche right in that morality is simply an expression of power? Well, my answer is no. Moral questions may not have objective answers, whether revealed by God or by science, but they do have rational ones. Answers rooted in a rationality that emerges out of social need. To understand that better, we need to look again at the transformation wrought by modernity. In the pre-modern world, social structures appear to be given. The moral question that people ask themselves is, what moral claims are rational given this social structure, which is fixed? With the coming of modernity, new possibilities of social transformation opened up. Ought, as I suggested, became a political as much as a moral demand. And people ask themselves not simply what moral claims are rational given this social structure, but also what social structures are rational. What kind of society, what types of social institutions, what forms of social relations best allow human lives, moral lives, to flourish? And the capacity to ask and to answer such questions has been nourished by a number of developments. One has been, for instance, the creation of what you might call new forms of social conversations. Political and moral debate moved out of the confines of a small elite and became central to the functioning of societies, from the printing press to the mass media, from political parties to social networking. A range of mechanisms help transform who is able to engage in such debate and the kinds of debates in which they can engage. At the same time, new tools have been fashioned, from the democratic process to revolutionary movements, from labour strikes to national liberation struggles, to enable people to act upon those conversations, to transform social conditions, to try to lever the world, if you like, from the way it was to the way it should be. And these developments help take moral claims beyond the subjective and the relative. The new kinds of social conversations flourish not just within societies, but between societies too. They became more universal, detached from specific social structures. At the same time, the mechanisms of social transformation enhanced the universalist possibilities inherent in the new social conversations. Social change and meaning beyond the boundaries of a particular community or a society. The idea of democracy had universal significance. The reverberations of the French Revolution, for instance, were felt throughout Europe and indeed well beyond Europe. What makes values non-arbitrary is not that they're fixed in some transcendental realm or that they're defined objectively by science, but that they emerge through humanity's collective judgment. To bring reason to bear upon social relations, to define a rational answer to a moral question, requires social engagement and collective action. And it is the breakdown in recent decades, perhaps over the past century, of such engagement and such action that has proved so devastating for moral thinking. The consequence of all this is that the relationship between what Alistair McIntyre calls man as he happens to be and man as he could be has become obscured, even broken. The secular fall of man, the loss of faith in the human capacity to act rationally and morally, and to collectively transform our works and our world. The growth of a much darker view of human nature. All this has narrowed the conception of what humans could be. It has confined our notion of what we are and eroded the link between the two. Let me finish with a quote from a book by Viktor Frankl, from his 1946 book, man's search for meaning. Frankl had spent 3 years incarcerated in German concentration camps, including 6 months in Auschwitz. A man's search for meaning is a meditation on that experience, a reflection on the ability of human beings to survive even the most degrading and tormenting of circumstances. Man, Frankl writes, should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. In the second edition of the book, there's a foreword by a rabbi, Howard Kushner, who suggests that this is a profoundly religious book. And in one sense it is. We have come to know man as he really is, wrote Frankl at the very end of the book. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he's also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Israel on his lips. It is, however, a very different kind of faith to that embodied in religious faith. Frankl's book is a hymn not to a transcendental deity, but to the human spirit. Humans, he suggests, find themselves only through creating meaning in the world. But meaning is not something to be discovered. It is something that humans, and only humans, create. And they do so by acting upon the world. Man is ultimately self-determining, Frankl writes. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence should be. The human condition, it seems to me, is that of possessing no moral safety net. No God, no scientific law, nor any amount of ethical concrete can protect us from falling off that moral tightrope that is to be human. Whether it's disconcerting or whether it's exhilarating, being human, that choice is ours.